Welcome to the Korea Society. I'm Stephen Harper, the Senior Director for Policy here, and we're delighted to have you here in our intimate audience and welcome those who are streaming online or listening via podcast or viewing via YouTube video. Today we continue in this year's series of young professionals in Asia policy, but we thought the particular topic and our particular featured speaker, Ankit Panda, would have interest to a broader audience, and certainly, given the numbers who subscribed, we were correct, I think, in thinking that. Ankit will be addressing Nukes, missiles, and dialogue, ways to talk, with Jonathan Corrado. Ankit comes to us as a Kim-Ku Professional Fellow, meaning he's gone through the Korea Society's professional series, and we're glad to have him back. He's also a frequent visitor here and participant in roundtables and public programs. But he's very well known to many of you and to those of you streaming for his work with the Diplomat. He's also an Adjunct Fellow with the Federation of American Scientists. He will have an ability, along with Jonathan, to give you something of some new perspectives, and he's just come from younger generation events, new generation events in Italy and in Japan, so he may well lean into that. But to guide us through this is my good friend and our Associate Director for Policy, Jonathan Corrado. Jonathan came to the Society almost exactly a year ago from McClarty Associates in Washington, D.C., and before that, Georgetown School of Foreign Service, where he completed a master's. So thank you both. We're looking forward to this discussion. Thank you all for joining us. And Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you, Ankit, for coming today. Ankit is one of those annoyingly talented scholars and analysts who is a generalist with the ability to pay attention to the minor details and the nitty-gritty, very much like a specialist. So he's got that bird's eye view and also that attention to detail. So I'm sure a lot of you have read his writing in the Diplomat, among other publications, and have seen him in appearances. He has a lot of insight. He's a talented writer, and we're lucky to have him here today. So thank you, Ankit, for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start with the latest. Let's talk about Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's trip over the weekend to North Korea. He said that there has been major progress and that he could see a path to denuclearization. We've gotten a little bit of a mixed assessment from the intelligence community officials on this notion. For instance, CIA Director Gina Haspel said that Kim Jong-un has been more serious about denuclearization and opportunities for using diplomacy to get us there, whereas Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats has been a little bit more reserved in terms of his tone on Kim Jong-un's willingness to make that ultimate transformation. As outsiders, we're sort of limited unless we break major national security laws in terms of what sort of information we have access to. So knowing what we know now, how can we evaluate the kind of progress that's being made? Do you think we are approaching a nexus point, an inflection point where we could see that transformation being possible? I wonder what your evaluation is.
Sure. So we have seen North Korea agree to a range of things this year. What we don't have from North Korea yet is an agreement on the nuclear issue related specifically to denuclearization. The word denuclearization has appeared in three important documents this year that Kim Jong-un himself has put his name on, namely the two Inter-Korean declarations of April 27th and September 19th, and one U.S.-North Korea joint statement signed in Singapore on June 12th. And while that word denuclearization appears in those documents, what that certainly hasn't meant, and what I think we have very little evidence of, is that this implies unilateral intention on North Korea's part to give up its nuclear weapons. And this is an important point because there's a reason we use this word denuclearization instead of disarmament in the context of the Korean Peninsula.
Can you get back to the origins of that? You were telling me before, and this is an interesting genesis. What is the origin of the use of that particular phrase?
Sure. This is, it's interesting history to retread. So the word denuclearization first appears in the Joint Inter-Korean Statement of February 1992. And that's 1 year after the United States removes tactical nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula. From 1958 to 1991, the United States based tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And after these were removed, the phrase denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula appears in this Inter-Korean Agreement of 1992. And what that means is really that both sides take steps to reduce nuclear threats and nuclear dangers from the Korean Peninsula. And that language I just used, nuclear threats, that appears in the 9/19, the September 19th declaration. So really, we're sort of talking about this very well-established path. And the word denuclearization, it continues to appear in popular coverage of North Korea, and I can see why a layperson might take that to mean that Kim Jong-un has agreed to give up his nuclear weapons. But really, the way the North Koreans see it, it's a tango for two. It is not unilateral nuclear abandonment. And actually, to the contrary, we do have pretty clear evidence from North Korea this year that they simply are not interested in that. On May 16th this year, after John Bolton, Donald Trump's national security advisor, went public and began talking about a Libya-style deal for North Korea, which very much was a model of unilateral nuclear abandonment. Kim Kye-gwan at the North Korean Foreign Ministry made it very clear that they aren't interested in this kind of unilateral nuclear abandonment. So everything we're talking about right now with regard to denuclearization is going to take steps from the U.S. side as well. And I can talk a bit about what these steps might look like.
Yeah, so we have a couple different interpretations for just what these differences in terms of the definition for denuclearization could mean. As you were saying earlier, there's a maximal interpretation and a minimal interpretation. So can you sort of portray that for us? What is the continuum here? On the one hand, what are the highest set of expectations that North Korea might have for America to make matching maneuvers in order to do the tango for two, as you said before? And on the other hand, what might be the minimal set of expectations? And then going one step further, how are administration officials in America and South Korea viewing the term denuclearization? Are we really so far apart because we have a difference in judgment for the definition of the term, or is this all just negotiation posture?
Well, so the nice thing is that a lot of this is up for negotiation. The North Koreans have left a range open of possible outcomes on the peninsula that would satisfy this aspirational goal to denuclearize the entire peninsula. The maximalist end, I think, is easier to describe and talk about in this imagination. Complete denuclearization, the phrase that appears in the inter-Korean agreements this year, can imply something as large as global nuclear disarmament. And that sounds a little bit fantastic, but the North Koreans will point out that the United States, as a nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has Article 6 obligations to work towards leaving nuclear weapons behind, and that is one form of complete global denuclearization. So in that sense, North Korea will give up its nuclear weapons once everybody else does, and the world is free of nuclear weapons. So that is the ultimate kind of maximalist conception of what that word means. On that side of the spectrum, we come to sort of other less maximalist understandings, including the United States simply departing Northeast Asia and certainly pulling back its nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence assurances from both South Korea and Japan. And obviously, this raises serious concerns for the alliance. It is the bedrock of the alliance with South Korea that the U.S. nuclear umbrella applies equally to South Korea as it does to U.S. territory. And with North Korea's development of an intercontinental range ballistic missile, this is one of those issues that is starting to really loom over the alliance. The technical phrase being decoupling, that now the set of incentives that the United States has to contend with leave it in this uncomfortable position where it has to make decisions about if it will trade San Francisco for Seoul in the case of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So that's another way to look at it. On the less maximalist end, and this is actually where we've sort of seen some movement, is modifications to the U.S. force posture on the peninsula, modifications to U.S. exercises, modifications to U.S. deterrent signaling. In recent years, the United States, after major North Korean provocations, for example, has flown strategic bombers, usually B-1 bombers, which are not nuclear capable, but in some cases we have seen B-2 bombers used, and North Korea sees this as a U.S. demonstration of a nuclear threat. And the United States will tell you that this is done to reassure allies after major nuclear tests or ballistic missile tests from North Korea. But again, these kinds of force structure modifications could be something that the North Koreans mean when it comes to U.S. movement towards denuclearization. But that's not an exhaustive list. There are other issues here.
Right, but I think you did a pretty good job casting a blanket over what the differences look like in that continuum. During a recent event at the Council on Foreign Relations, President Moon had said that even after a peace treaty, there's a role for the alliance, the U.S.-South Korean alliance. So we could see some some things to continue discussing here and looking for ways to where are the concessions. So now I want to move to a hypothetical scenario, which is given that there are all these areas which need to have concessions. If I were to put you in the NSC and you were going to advise President Trump tomorrow, which are the realistic expectations? What are the avenues for negotiation? What would you sort of suggest?
Sure. Yeah, this is something I've been giving a lot of thought to. The biggest prescription that I have on North Korea policy right now for the United States and for the alliance is to push on the doors that are most likely to open with North Korea. And this door, in my view today, is arms control and managing the problem, rather than trying to completely solve the problem through the older framework of pursuing the complete, verifiable, and irreversible disarmament of North Korea. I think North Korea's nuclear force development has simply come too far to be rolled back in that way today. We can leave that on the table as an aspirational objective over the decades, but in the immediate term, I think the most pressing concern with North Korea is the qualitative improvement of its nuclear forces and the quantitative expansion of its nuclear forces. And here's where what's happening this year gives me cause for concern. So today, just a few hours ago in the Oval Office, actually with Kanye West, President Trump made the comment that things are going great with North Korea. There's no more nuclear tests. There's no more missile tests. There's no more nothing. And that's paraphrasing, but that's roughly what he said exactly. But the first two bits of that are correct, and we can all see that there haven't been any nuclear tests or ballistic missile tests. Those are very easy to verify. There's infrastructure in space to tell us when North Korea tests ballistic missiles, and they haven't been doing that this year. That's great. We haven't had to live with biweekly headlines like we did last year of a new ballistic missile coming out of North Korea and in some cases overflying Japanese territory. But that last bit, that no more nothing is taking place, and the president's made remarks to this effect before, that total denuclearization is happening. That couldn't be further from the truth. And this is a truth that's not very easily perceptible in public. North Korea has made an important change in the way it talks about its nuclear weapons and how it publicizes them. It was quite unusual for North Korea as a nuclear weapon state to show us so much of what it had accomplished with its nuclear forces. We had regular military parades. We had footage being released of Kim Jong-un inspecting ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons. This year, none of that. So we can maybe turn a bit to the slides that I've prepared.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask you to set this up a little bit.
Yeah.
About some of the commitments that have been made for the Pyongyang Declaration, with particular attention to the dismantlement of the Sohae launch facility and then to Yongbyon as well.
Yeah, so I'll get to that, but I did want to begin with this gentleman right here, Kim Jong-un, who on January 1st this year delivered his traditional New Year's Day address, in which he lays out, since 2013, has laid out the annual objectives for his country. And on January 1st, 2017, Kim Jong-un laid out a pretty clear objective that North Korea would be developing an intercontinental range ballistic missile capability, and then the North Koreans went ahead and did exactly that. So North Korea is sometimes seen as a very complex and opaque country, but there's a lot of times when they tell us exactly what they're planning on doing, and then we do see them accomplish that. And this year at the New Year's Day address, and this was before the Charm Offensive, the meetings, the summits, the diplomacy, the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, all of that, right before all of that, he uses this opportunity to call, first of all, he celebrates the completion of his nuclear deterrent force, which he had also done with the November 2017 test of the Hwasong-15, North Korea's largest and most powerful ballistic missile. He uses the New Year's Day address then to not only celebrate the completion of that objective, which he had set out in 2017, but to also call for the mass production of ballistic missiles and warheads. And that activity has been going on behind the scenes. We've had a few intelligence reports leaked to that effect, talking about fissile material production. In fact, Mike Pompeo, when he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, came clean about the fact that he couldn't deny that North Korea was continuing to enrich uranium. So these activities are continuing behind the scene.
So how many weapons, how many warheads are they capable of producing now, according to our best estimates? I've heard 20 to 60. Do we think that that's changed in a major way?
So there's a few assessments floating out there. The Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, as of July 2018, assessed that North Korea has enough fissile material for 65 nuclear weapons. There was a smaller CIA assessment of around 20 weapons, and that assessment is the nuclear weapons that North Korea has fully assembled that would be potentially ready for use if they were to become necessary. And what's more concerning is the rate at which North Korea is accruing more fissile material. And the assessment there from the DIA and NGA is around 12 weapons worth of fissile material a year.
Okay. So now let's talk about those commitments that they made and how that might affect that ability to produce at that level.
So fissile material, the fuel for nuclear weapons, plutonium and uranium, is something that hasn't really been part of the concessions that North Korea has offered this year. So maybe let's talk a bit about the kinds of concessions that we've seen first.
Okay.
So unilateral concessions from North Korea have received a lot of coverage this year. So at the April 20th meeting of the Central Committee in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un delivers a major work report in which he not only celebrates the successful completion of his previous 5-year campaign under the Pyongjin Line, which was the simultaneous pursuit of nuclear weapons and economic prosperity. Kim Jong-un acknowledges that was successfully completed, and he announced a new strategic line which has received a lot of coverage this year. This is his new focus on the economy. And in line with that, he signals that North Korea is now going to behave like a much more normal and responsible nuclear country. It's going to stop nuclear testing. North Korea was the only country to have tested nuclear weapons in the 21st century. And so Kim Jong-un says that North Korea will transparently dismantle its northern nuclear test site known as Punggye-ri. This is where North Korea conducted all 6 of its nuclear tests beginning in 2006, and with the most recent test having occurred in September 2017. And then in May, we have reporters invited to the Punggye-ri site to witness large explosions. It's hard for me to say exactly what these explosions really meant because North Korea did not invite any kind of expert observers to ensure that the entire length of the tunnel network under Mount Mantap, where they've carried out some of their largest tests, that entire tunnel network was collapsed instead of just the entrance to the tunnels. But in any case, the North Koreans made some kind of disarmament gestures at this nuclear testing site. And the value of that gesture is, again, a little dubious. It is easily reversible. If and when this testing site does become necessary again, North Korea can re-excavate the entrances most likely and simply begin testing in a matter of months, if not weeks. And then there's the matter of North Korea's actual nuclear weapons design work. They may be satisfied with the weapons designs that they already have in their possession and no longer have a need to conduct full yield nuclear testing. All the other nuclear powers do not conduct nuclear testing, but manage their nuclear arsenals through things like subcritical testing. And here's one of the things that was interesting about Kim Jong-un's April address. For the first time, a North Korean leader acknowledged that the country had conducted subcritical testing, which was a foregone conclusion because we assumed that they were doing this, but Kim Jong-un decided to make that public in this address, with the implication being that even as this test site closes for full yield testing, they could continue the kinds of subcritical testing that would allow North Korea to ensure the reliability, the safety of its nuclear weapons. So the value here is dubious, but certainly it won North Korea goodwill. It was seen as one of the enablers of the June 12th summit meeting, with U.S. officials pointing to this as a gesture of North Korea's goodwill. So I actually like to compare this to the 2008 collapse of the cooling tower at the Yongbyon nuclear complex. At the time, this was hailed as a significant gesture towards denuclearization, but of course, just months later, in early 2009, North Korea would pull out of the 6-party talks after a satellite launch. So the gesture there is quite similar in my view. So this is another piece of equipment that's been in the headlines. This is North Korea's static engine test stand for large diameter rocket engines at Sohae, which is the country's western testing site. And this is where this site also has other facilities associated with North Korea's space launch program. But this right here is where North Korea tested the engines that powered the first stage of the 2 ICBMs we saw tested last year. So in September 2016 and in March 2017, Kim Jong-un observed 2 different engines being tested here. One of those was a 40-ton engine that appeared in the Hwasong-15, and the other was a 40-ton variant of that same engine that appeared in the Hwasong-12 intermediate-range ballistic missile that North Korea launched over Japan, and the Hwasong-14. And verbally at the Singapore summit, Kim Jong-un conveyed to Donald Trump that he was ready to dismantle this site. And I suspect that North Korea came to the summit prepared with another gesture to offer the United States, and this was that gesture. Again, when it comes to limiting North Korea's quantitative expansion, this is again slightly dubious because North Korea can simply test its engines at other facilities. It has two smaller static engine test stands, one of them at a site known as Chamjin, which is a well-known North Korean missile factory, and another at Tonghae, which is North Korea's eastern satellite testing facility, which hasn't been used since 2009. Although those test stands cannot accommodate the kinds of large ICBM engines that they tested.
So
here.
if we could talk about the difference between a static engine test site and
Sure.
the alternative would be a dynamic engine test site. What would the alternative be? And
Well, so the
how are they
alternative
doing
would be to just fly a ballistic missile to see that engine in action. So this allows you to test the engine in a completely static environment. So this structure is created to resist the thrust generated by the engine, allowing North Korea's rocket scientists to observe things like the flow of the propellant and the oxidizer through the engine, make sure that everything is working well before it has to be mounted on a ballistic missile.
Okay.
But the interesting thing here is that if North Korea is manufacturing more ballistic missiles, it will likely need to conduct further testing. Before you mount an engine on a ballistic missile, you do want to make sure that it's working in a static environment like this. So there may be another site that we simply don't know about, but this one that's been highly publicized in North Korean propaganda has already seen some dismantlement. So according to imagery analysts at 38 North, who first spotted this in, I believe, July this year, the metal superstructure, the top bit, was completely dismantled by the end of July. And that came right after the Singapore summit, showing that the North Koreans were again delivering on what they'd said they would do. That bottom concrete structure, the more difficult part to reassemble, remains in place as of today. We could see that blown up. This is again a structure that's fully visible from space. We can watch North Korea dismantle it as necessary. But like I said, again, the value here for the quantitative expansion of North Korea's nuclear forces is limited to non-existent.
Okay. Good.
Oh, this is the other part of the Sohae launch site. So this is some still footage from, I believe, the 2012 December launch of the Unha-3 satellite. The site has seen some changes since then, but at the most recent Inter-Korean summit, one of the concessions we saw related to the dismantlement of Tongchangri, or another name for the Sohae Satellite Launching Center, relates to these facilities here. And this is associated with North Korea's space program. There's a range of structures here that could potentially be part of what North Korea means by its resolution to dismantle the launch pad. There's some interesting translation differences between the North Korean English translation and the South Korean English translation of the September 19th declaration that I think merit attention. For instance, the South Koreans chose to translate the Korean with the word dismantle, and the North Koreans used the word shut down. And I think we know from history that these kinds of details really do matter when it comes to agreements with North Korea.
So the Korean word is pegi, which I think should mean dispose of, scrap, toss, destroy. So I think it has a little bit of a stronger connotation. So I factor that into the way that the differences in interpretation.
Exactly.
Figure.
I do like, this is one of the areas where the English translations, I think, have some value in sort of signaling intention. So the fact that the North Koreans chose to translate it as shut down, I think is an interesting choice. But anyways, you have a large gantry structure here to facilitate preparations for satellite launch activities. Again, in the imagery published by 38 North, we do see some evidence that North Korea dismantled a staging building near the gantry structure to indicate that they were serious about dismantling parts of this program. And then we have other buildings nearby, like fuel and oxidizer storage buildings related to their satellite program. This part I find a little bit puzzling. If you recall, we had a military parade in early September this year. North Korea did not include any nuclear-capable systems in that parade, which, again, was kind of an important gesture towards this new nuclear normal that we're seeing, that North Korea is going to flaunt its nuclear capabilities a lot less. But what we did see, which was really unsurprising to me, was a parade float celebrating North Korea's space program. So as part of this new strategic line that North Korea is talking about, Kim Jong-un and other senior officials have pointed to North Korea's scientific prowess and North Korea's desire to become a scientific power. And they've been quite adamant that the space program is a peaceful civilian initiative, even though the technologies that appear in their ICBMs and other long-range missiles and their space launchers, there is quite a great deal of overlap there. But it would be quite interesting if they did decide to move ahead with dismantling the Sohae site. Again, it would not put an end to their ability to conduct space launches.
Do they have any road mobile, transportable, portable space launch capability? I know that there are other countries that have this, right? Like China, for instance.
Yeah, so China and Israel have conducted space launches off of transporters, the kinds of road mobile launchers that North Korea uses for its intercontinental range ballistic missiles. It's an uncommon practice. There's a lot of reasons not to do that. A big reason being that you're limited by the kind of size of payload that you can launch off a road mobile satellite launcher, but North Korea could move to something like that. They also do have that East Coast site, Sohae, that they haven't used since 2009. That could be refurbished and developed into a replacement space site. I'd be surprised if they completely abandon their space launch program. They're actually building a new satellite control center in Pyongyang that's quite ritzy. That's been under construction this year, and they've actually added a major annex next to it, which suggests that if anything, they're planning on improving their space capabilities. But certainly this is now something that is also in play.
Interesting. Do we have another? Have we
I think we're out of slides, but do you want to talk about Yongbyon?
Let's talk about Yongbyon.
Okay.
So this is round 2 on Yongbyon, right? We've seen it previously, and now we're going to see it again. What is the importance of Yongbyon for North Korea's overall arsenal? How significant would it be if they were to destroy it and have? There's talk about actually having observers there, unlike the previous unobserved, largely symbolic destruction of the Punggye-ri site. This would be a little bit more thorough and perhaps meaningful in that regard. Let's say that it does happen. What does that mean? What are the implications? What is North Korea's ability to continue producing nuclear material like after that?
Mm-hmm. So at the onset of this discussion on Yongbyon, I just want to point out that while we do see the word Yongbyon in play in the U.S.-North Korea dialogue again, it's really important to note that the September 19th Inter-Korean Declaration was really, Section 5, Subclause 2, which is the one where Yongbyon appears, is worded very carefully. It says that if the United States pursues or comes clean with corresponding measures, and these could be any range of things: end of war declaration, ending the Korean War, sanctions relief, then North Korea would proceed with further denuclearization steps, such as the dismantlement of Yongbyon. So it's not. So the Yongbyon issue is quite different from all of these things, which are unilateral commitments that Kim Jong-un has already agreed to. This is something more akin to a shiny object being dangled in front of Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, saying that if you do come back maybe to another summit, or you give us sanctions relief or an end of war declaration, then these are some of the things that you could look forward to. And Yongbyon's a big one, and it's not insignificant. It's not perfect. It doesn't nip the North Korean nuclear program's ability to expand at the bud, but it does some really important things. So this is a facility that's well known to International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors who had been on the ground in Yongbyon as recently as 2008 and had provided all sorts of verification services there. This is where North Korea's plutonium program is the heart of the entire plutonium program. And there are a range of facilities there. So there's about 300 buildings in the main complex, but the big ones being the 5-megawatt reactor. It's a gas graphite moderated reactor that North Korea uses to produce plutonium, and also to produce things like tritium, which are quite important for the larger nuclear weapons, the thermonuclear weapons that it has claimed to have developed as of last year. And these are the ones, again, that the United States would worry a bit more about, because these would be the weapons that would be aimed at U.S. cities. And disabling Yongbyon would actually have a pretty important implication in limiting North Korea's ability to produce tritium. And it's hard to say that with absolute confidence, but it's likely given what we know about North Korea's various sites. Yongbyon also does have uranium enrichment facilities, but importantly, it is not the only site in North Korea for the enrichment of uranium. So this is where, this is also, the subtitle here is Ways to Talk with North Korea. And I think this is really where the upcoming process that we're now anticipating, led by Steve Biegun, the special representative, and his North Korean counterpart, probably Cho Sun-hui, will be quite important. This is where these details need to be worked out, because we don't know what it really means. And so here's another translation difference. In the North Korean version, I think we have facilities singular. South Korean version has facilities plural. what does it mean to disable Yongbyon here? Are we only talking about the 5 megawatt reactor? And that reactor, by the way, might also be at the end of its life. North Korea does have what we think is an experimental light water reactor next door, and they could simply activate that after shutting down the 5 megawatt reactor. So there's a lot of ways here that things could go wrong. And also given the fact that we don't have a unilateral assurance yet to do anything with Yongbyon, I think is important. But when we think about ways to talk, I mean, if we are heading towards a new summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, which I think is likely, that's not going to be the venue where these details get, hashed out. I think that'll be another opportunity for the two sides to pledge to normalize U.S.-DPRK relations, work towards a peace regime and denuclearization. But it'll really be at the working group level where a lot of these details get hammered out.
So evaluating the fact that Steve Biegun, the special envoy for North Korea talks, finally has a counterpart as a very important step in the right direction in that regard. If we're going to really get working level talks towards the nuts and bolts kind of progress that needs to be done if denuclearization is going to happen. I want to move along to the inter-Korean commitments for military threat reduction along the DMZ made at the Pyongyang Declaration the last time that South Korean President Moon Jae-in met with Chairman Kim Jong-un. What are the significant steps that were made there, and how are these affecting or moving along the overall process?
Sure. This was a really important outcome that didn't receive a lot of attention in the United States because it didn't have to do with nuclear weapons, as often as so many things related to the Korean Peninsula security situation are. So a lot of skeptics of the inter-Korean process this year have pointed to the fact that a lot of what we've seen between the two Koreas has been quite familiar, ranging from the people-to-people exchanges, talk about tourism, and obviously the economic promises. A lot of that has rung true from the experiences in 2000 and 2007. The Inter-Korean Declaration on Military Confidence Building, implementing the Panmunjom Declaration agreed to on September 19th, is a significant new step in many ways. So the two Koreas agreed to a range of measures to reduce chances for accidental clashes on land, sea, and air along the military demarcation line. So there's a no-fly zone. There's sort of commitments to pull back guard posts and units from the demilitarized zone. Right now, as we speak, there is demining activity going on at the joint security area along the DMZ. So this is a lot of this has never been tried before, and it does suggest that the inter-Korean process now is starting to yield important dividends on the peninsula. We also significantly have heard recently from the deputy commander of USFK that for the first time since March 2013, North Korea is now again using the military-to-military hotline with UNC, which is again a significant development. So this is the kind of stuff that had a lot of people worrying last year when Fire and Fury was in the air, and the possibility of a military miscalculation on the Korean Peninsula grew rather frighteningly large. So it is a very good thing that the two Koreas are talking on a military-to-military level.
As a quick aside, we had our Sherman Scholar recipient this year is Dong-se Kim, who's an architect, and his title was Imagining the Impossible, the DMZ as a Productive and Inclusive Space. And seeing these developments happen, particularly the demining activity, et cetera, he said, I think I'm going to have to change the title of my presentation to Imagining the Possible. So for him, it was a big transformation. And I think to a lot of South Koreans as well, this is the kind of thing that a threat reduction is always a positive. And if we're going to move away from the chance of miscalculation, that's a seriously good sign.
Yeah, and there are still skeptics. When I was in Seoul earlier this summer, I had the opportunity to speak to a few former South Korean military officers, and they expressed some reservations about some of the proposals. I was there, for example, when the artillery reduction talks were underway, and that proposal did not end up succeeding because due to a variety of reasons. But another proposal that was in the air that actually did end up becoming part of this new inter-Korean military threat reduction agreement relates to the no-fly zone. And here there are some concerns on the South Korean side that if we do return, unfortunately, to an era of tensions, that South Korea's hands will be quite tied in terms of aerial surveillance of North Korean activities by this no-fly zone, simply because South Korea has a lot more advanced aerial assets than North Korea does.
And this gets into the idea of are there a necessary amount of necessary asymmetric commitments that need to be made in order to push the process along, or are those not worth making? The high-ranking defector Tae Young-ho, a former diplomat in London, recently said that he thinks what's happening right now is that Kim Jong-un is angling for a switchover from the declaration for declaration idea, which involves America providing an end to the war declaration, America and South Korea giving an end to war declaration with North Korea in exchange for a declaration of production facilities and testing facilities, the locations of those. He thinks that the angle right now is a move away from that and towards something that would look like an ICBM reduction in order to satisfy America's perception of threat, and also South Korea and Japan, who are acutely affected, but more so because of the long-range ICBMs that affect Washington. How do you view the possibility for that kind of bait and switch?
I mean, so, Tae Yong-ho definitely has much better insight into North Korean leadership decision-making than any of us do. So I definitely, take that seriously. And this has been something that's come up with North Korea's development of an ICBM. If we understand North Korea's long-standing strategic objective in Northeast Asia to separate the United States from its allies, agreeing to an ICBM-only deal would not be the worst way to do that. It would certainly sidestep a lot of concerns that Japan has had. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been really clear about the fact that any agreement with North Korea has to include chemical, biological weapons, shorter-range missiles that can threaten Japanese territory. So the United States agreeing to sort of an America-first ICBM deal would be a really good way to, I think, signal to the allies that really the allied commitments that should exist and the way that diplomacy should be carried out in an allied context is not really the American priority. Going back to declaration, though, I think we've also seen evidence from the North Korean side in past weeks that they're not interested in doing declaration for declaration, but not in the way that Tae Yong-ho has implied. I think that the ball is now shifting into a different court where it's not declaration for declaration. It is sanctions relief is what the United States needs to provide in order for things to move forward. And I think this is what we saw with Ri Yong-ho's speech here in New York City this year. That was really one of the emphases that really jumped out to me, which again is not surprising. And we are seeing North Korea sort of gain support for this. We just had a trilateral statement come out with North Korea, Russia, and China arguing against unilateral U.S. sanctions. And we are starting to see bits of momentum develop now. This could really become a prominent issue at the Security Council, where North Korea could potentially ask for sanctions relief for the mere fact that it is no longer testing nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles. And it might have a case, but the United States would have to make a serious policy change. And this, I would expect to be actually one of the major issues to come up at a second U.S.-North Korea summit.
I wanted to ask you about your personal professional journey that got you into disarmament in general, and then the Korean Peninsula in particular. What brought you towards this path?
So I think I probably have to credit it to my upbringing. I grew up living all over Asia a little bit, and spending a little time in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia, and a little bit of time in Europe. But it got me interested in international affairs, international security, and I've always sort of been a technically minded person. So combine all of that with my recent reporting interest in the Korean Peninsula, which really grew serious in late 2013. Actually, I think I remember exactly where I was when Jang Sung-taek was murdered. I was in New York City, down by Union Square, and I was filing a report, and that was the time when I really started to get a lot more interested in sort of technical aspects of North Korea. And this was kind of the time when Kim Jong-un's power consolidation project in North Korea was starting to get a lot more interest. And before I knew it, 2015 leads to 2016, and the missile testing campaign really begins to take off. And that's when I really sort of got drawn into this community. And the disarmament work, non-proliferation work, I think also just relates to my general background in international security and being interested in wanting to see a safer world.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. And if you'd be so kind as to fill out the feedback forms that we have placed on the chairs. Thank you for everyone who has joined us virtually, who is tuning in either via live stream, watching later on YouTube, or listening to the podcast. We've got a lot of great programs coming up. Please check out our website at koreasociety.org to learn about those. And please join me in thanking Ankit Panda for a great talk.